Mythical had always believed that family was everything. At 17, she lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town so small it barely appeared on maps. Her mother had died when Sarah was 12, leaving her alone with her father, Thomas Mitchell, a man whose drinking had slowly consumed whatever goodness once lived in his heart. Years following her mother's death had been difficult. Thomas, once a respected blacksmith in their community, had lost job after job due to his unpredictable temper and constant drinking. Their small savings dwindled, and creditors began appearing at their door with increasing frequency. Sarah watched helplessly as her father transformed from a grieving widower into someone she barely recognized. Matters worse, Thomas had begun bringing home dangerous associates from the local tavern. These men would stay late into the night, drinking heavily and making Sarah deeply uncomfortable with their leering stares and crude comments. She had learned to lock herself in her small room when they arrived, but the thin walls offered little protection from their loud voices and threatening laughter. As days were filled with backbreaking work, she tended to their small vegetable garden, which had become their primary source of food. She walked 3 miles each way to the nearest well to fetch water, carrying heavy buckets that left her shoulders aching. She mended their worn clothing by candlelight and tried to keep their cabin clean despite her father's increasingly destructive behavior. Isolation was perhaps the hardest part. Thomas had forbidden her from attending the local school or church, claiming he needed her help at home. Sarah's few childhood friends had gradually stopped visiting as her father's reputation in the community deteriorated. She felt completely alone in the world, with no one to turn to for help or guidance. Particularly difficult nights, Sarah would climb onto the cabin's roof and stare at the stars, dreaming of a different life. She imagined traveling to distant cities, learning to read properly, maybe even becoming a teacher herself someday. These dreams felt impossible, but they gave her the strength to face each new day. Only source of comfort came from an unexpected friendship. An elderly Shawnee woman named lived in a small camp about a mile through the woods. Sarah had discovered her while foraging for wild berries one afternoon. Despite the language barrier and cultural differences, the two had formed a tentative friendship. It taught Sarah how to identify medicinal plants and how to move quietly through the forest. One of their meetings had noticed bruises on Sarah's arms from her father's increasingly violent outbursts. Though they couldn't communicate well through words, the older woman's eyes conveyed deep understanding and concern. She gave Sarah a small leather pouch filled with dried herbs, gesturing that Sarah should make tea from them when the pain became too much to bear. Secret visits became Sarah's lifeline. The Shawnee woman represented everything Sarah's world lacked: peace, wisdom, and genuine care for others. Would sometimes hum traditional songs while they worked together, and Sarah found these melodies stayed with her during her darkest moments at home. Winter approached, Sarah's situation grew more desperate. Their food stores were nearly empty, and Thomas had sold most of their furniture to buy alcohol. The roof leaked in several places, and they had no money for repairs. Sarah's clothes were becoming too small and too worn, but Thomas refused to acknowledge her needs, claiming she was being ungrateful for everything he provided. And who visited their cabin were becoming bolder and more threatening. Sarah noticed how they watched her when they thought Thomas was looking. She heard them making comments about her growing into a fine young woman that made her stomach turn with fear. When she tried to express her concerns to her father, he dismissed her worries and told her she was being dramatic. Particularly cold evening in November, Sarah overheard a conversation that chilled her to the bone. Thomas was discussing her future with one of his drinking companions, a man named who owned a small farm 20 miles away. Was offering to take Sarah off Thomas's hands in exchange for canceling a substantial debt. The way they talked about her made it clear they saw her not as a person, but as property to be traded. Night, Sarah lay awake in her small bed, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in their cabin walls. She realized that her father was planning to essentially sell her to, who had a reputation for mistreating the women in his household. 2 of his previous wives had died under suspicious circumstances, and the local authorities had never investigated thoroughly. The first time in her life, Sarah began seriously considering escape. She had no money, no family to turn to, and winter was approaching fast. The nearest town was over 30 miles away, and she had no idea how she would survive such a journey alone. Yet staying seemed to guarantee a fate worse than any hardship she might face in the wilderness. Began making small preparations in secret. She started hiding bits of food whenever possible, storing them in a small sack under her mattress. She mended her sturdiest clothes and gathered what little she owned that might be useful for travel. She even began practicing walking silently, inspired by the techniques had shown her during their forest walks. Weight of her situation pressed down on her like a physical burden. She was just a 17-year-old girl with no education, no resources, and no experience with the outside world. Every practical consideration suggested that escape was impossible, yet something deep inside her refused to accept the fate her father had planned. Her next visit with Sarah tried to communicate her desperate situation. Using gestures and the few Shawnee words she had learned, she conveyed that she was in danger and might need to leave soon. His response surprised her. The older woman became very serious and began speaking rapidly in Shawnee, gesturing toward the deeper forest. Sarah couldn't understand the words she sensed that was trying to tell her something important. The Shawnee woman drew symbols in the dirt, pointing in different directions, and seeming to describe people or places Sarah might find. Sarah realized that was offering her information about escape routes or safe havens, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. December approached, Thomas's drinking increased, and his mood became even more unpredictable. He would fly into violent rages over minor issues, throwing furniture and screaming threats that echoed through their small cabin. Sarah learned to read the warning signs and hide when these episodes were building, but she couldn't always escape his anger. Final straw came on a snowy evening in early December, arrived at their cabin with a formal proposal and a small bag of coins. Sarah listened in horror from her hiding place as the 2 men negotiated the terms of her transfer to his property. They discussed her like livestock, debating her strength, her potential value as a worker, and her suitability for bearing children. Demanded to inspect his purchase. Sarah knew she was out of time. Her father called for her to come out of her room, his voice carrying an edge of violence that she had learned to fear. As she heard heavy footsteps approaching her door, Sarah made a desperate decision that would change everything. He had hidden her small bundle of supplies under her bed for weeks, always ready for the moment when escape became her only option. Now, with his demanding voice growing louder and her father's angry shouts filling the cabin, Sarah grabbed her bundle and slipped out through the small window at the back of her room. Snow was falling heavily, and the temperature was well below freezing. Sarah had no coat heavy enough for such weather, but she couldn't hesitate. Behind her, she heard the door to her room bang open and angry voices discovering her absence. She knew they would search for her, and she knew that being caught would mean facing consequences far worse than anything she had endured before. With her heart pounding and her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, Sarah ran toward the forest where she had always found solace with. She had no clear plan beyond reaching the Shawnee camp and hopping for guidance. The snow made every step difficult, and the darkness made navigation nearly impossible, but determination drove her forward. She stumbled through the trees. Sarah could hear voices behind her calling her name. The tone was anger rather than concerned, confirming her worst fears about what awaited her if she was caught. She pressed deeper into the woods, following paths she had learned during her peaceful visits with, now using them to flee from everything she had ever known. Cold was brutal, cutting through her inadequate clothing and making her fingers numb within minutes. Her feet, protected only by worn leather shoes, began to lose feeling as she trudged through the deepening snow. Yet Sarah forced herself to keep moving, knowing that stopping would mean either freezing to death or being dragged back to face ownership and her father's wrath. She finally reached the area where camp should have been. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. The site was empty, with only faint traces in the snow suggesting recent habitation. The Shawnee woman and her people had moved on for the winter, leaving Sarah alone in the wilderness with no shelter and no guidance. In the falling snow, exhausted and terrified, Sarah faced the reality of her situation. She was 17 years old, alone in a winter forest, with no survival skills beyond what little had taught her. She had no idea which direction might lead to safety, and she could already feel her body beginning to succumb to the deadly cold. Even in the moment of absolute despair, something inside Sarah refused to give up. She thought of her mother's gentle strength, of quiet wisdom, and of all the dreams she had nurtured while staring at the stars from her cabin roof. She had come too far to surrender now, and whatever fate awaited her in the forest couldn't be worse than the one she had fled. Trembling hands, Sarah gathered fallen branches and tried to remember everything it had taught her about survival in the woods. She found a partially sheltered spot between two large trees and began building a small windbreak, working by feel in the darkness as the snow continued to fall around her. Night stretched ahead of her, full of unknown dangers and challenges she had never imagined facing. But for the first time in years, Sarah was truly free to determine her own fate. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms, with dignity and courage her mother would have been proud of. She huddled in her makeshift shelter. Sarah whispered a prayer to whatever forces might be listening in the darkness. She prayed for strength, for guidance, and for the chance to build a life worth living. The wind howled through the trees above her, but beneath its sound she thought she could hear something else, the distant rhythm of hoofbeats approaching through the snow. The sound of hoofbeats grew stronger through the falling snow, and Sarah's heart raced with both hope and terror. She pressed herself deeper into her makeshift shelter, unsure whether the approaching rider represented salvation or another threat. In the darkness, she couldn't tell if the sounds belonged to her father in searching for her, or to someone else entirely. Hoofbeats stopped nearby, and Sarah heard a gentle voice speaking in Shawnee. The tone was calm and reassuring, completely different from the angry voices that had driven her into the forest. A moment later, she heard the same voice speaking broken English, calling out softly that he meant no harm and was looking for someone who might need help. Feeling her courage, Sarah called out weakly from her hiding place. Within moments, a young Shawnee man appeared at the edge of her shelter, leading a strong black horse. His name was, which meant strong and courageous in his language, though he told Sarah she could call him if it was easier for her. Perhaps 20 years old, with kind eyes that immediately put Sarah at ease. He had been traveling to meet his grandmother at their winter camp when he discovered that she and the others had left urgent messages about a young white woman who might be in danger. Had sent him to search for Sarah, worried about her safety after their last meeting. Without hesitation, shared his warm cloak with Sarah and offered her food from his travel pack. He built a proper fire using techniques that seemed almost magical to Sarah, creating warmth and light from what had seemed like a hopeless situation. As the flames danced between them, listen carefully as Sarah explained her desperate flight from her father's cabin. Expression grew serious as he learned about Thomas Mythical's plans and his involvement. He told Sarah that was known among the local tribes as a dangerous man who had caused suffering for many families, both native and white. Assured her that she had been right to flee and that he would help her find safety. Warmth of the fire and his calm presence allowed Sarah to truly rest for the first time in months. As she ate the dried meat and corn cakes he offered, explained that he could take her to the winter camp where and the others were staying. It was a 3-day journey through difficult terrain, but they would be safe there until spring, when more options might become available. The next 3 days, as they traveled deeper into Shawnee territory, Sarah discovered a way of life completely different from anything she had known. Taught her how to read signs in the forest, how to find water even when none was visible, and how to move quietly through the wilderness without leaving obvious tracks. Shawnee's approach to survival was based on working with nature rather than fighting against it. Showed Sarah how to identify plants that could provide nutrition even in winter, how to predict weather changes by observing animal behavior, and how to find shelter in places that seemed impossible. These lessons fascinated Sarah, who had always felt more at peace in the forest than in her father's cabin. Their journey also shared stories of his people's history and traditions. Sarah learned about the Shawnee belief that all living things were connected, and that strength came not from dominating others but from understanding one's place in the larger web of life. These ideas were revolutionary to Sarah, who had grown up in a world where power meant the ability to control and harm others. Of his grandmother with deep respect and love, he explained that she was considered a wisdom keeper among their people, someone who preserved important knowledge about healing, diplomacy, and spiritual matters. Had immediately recognized Sarah's good heart during their forest meetings, and had asked to watch over her if she ever needed help. They finally reached the winter camp. Sarah was amazed by what she found. The Shawnee had created a thriving community in a valley that seemed hidden from the outside world. Their dwellings were warm and comfortable, built to work with the natural landscape rather than imposing upon it. The people welcomed Sarah with genuine kindness, treating her not as an outsider, but as someone worthy of protection and respect. Sarah with tears of joy, having worried constantly about her young friend's safety. Through translation, she explained that Sarah could stay with them for as long as needed. The Shawnee had a tradition of providing sanctuary to those fleeing from violence or oppression, regardless of their background or origin. The winter months, Sarah's life transformed in ways she had never imagined possible. She learned the Shawnee language, gradually becoming able to communicate directly with and the other women in the camp. She mastered new skills like tanning hides, preserving food, and creating beautiful beadwork that told stories through patterns and colors. Importantly, Sarah began to heal from years of fear and trauma. The Shawnee understanding of healing encompassed not just physical wounds, but emotional and spiritual ones as well. Worked with Sarah using traditional ceremonies and medicines, helping her process her experiences and rebuild her sense of self-worth. Became Sarah's closest friend and guide during this transformation. He was patient and kind as he taught her, never making her feel ignorant or inadequate despite the vast differences in their upbringings. Sarah began to see him not just as a rescuer, but as someone who truly understood and valued her as a person. Winter also brought challenges that tested Sarah's growing strength. Food was sometimes scarce, and the cold was more intense than anything she had experienced before. There were moments when she wondered if she had made the right choice in fleeing her father's cabin, despite its danger. In these difficult times, would sit with Sarah and share stories of other women who had overcome seemingly impossible situations. She spoke of Shawnee women who had led their people through times of war and hardship, and of women from other backgrounds who had found strength they never knew they possessed. Stories helped Sarah understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite being afraid. She began to see her escape from her father's cabin not as a desperate flight, but as the first step in claiming her own power and dignity. Spring approached, Sarah faced difficult decisions about her future, and had made it clear that she was welcome to remain with the Shawnee permanently, and part of her was tempted by this offer. She had found peace and purpose in their community that she had never known before. First, Sarah also felt drawn to explore the wider world that had been to her for so long. She wanted to learn to read and write properly, to understand the laws and customs that governed the society beyond the forest, and perhaps to help other young women who might face situations similar to what she had endured. Ported whatever choice Sarah wanted to make, but he also shared his own feelings about their friendship. Over the months they had spent together, he had come to care for her deeply, and he hoped that whatever path she chose might include him in some way. Was touched by his honesty, and she realized that her feelings for him had grown far beyond gratitude for his rescue. He represented everything she had never experienced in a relationship: respect, kindness, patience, and genuine partnership. With him, she felt valued for who she was rather than what others could take from her. There, they began planning for Sarah's future in a way that honored both her need for independence and their growing connection. Knew of missionaries and teachers in distant settlements who helped young people learn skills needed for survival in both white and native communities. The plan they developed was ambitious but achievable. Sarah would spend the spring and summer learning advanced English skills and basic mathematics from a missionary teacher knew. In the fall, she would return to the Shawnee camp to continue her education in traditional knowledge and healing practices from. This arrangement would allow Sarah to bridge both worlds, gaining the skills she needed to build an independent life while maintaining the connections and wisdom she had discovered among the Shawnee. Would travel between communities as well, trading and maintaining relationships that could benefit both their peoples. The snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared in the valley. Sarah prepared for the next phase of her journey. She was no longer the frightened, powerless girl who had fled her father's cabin in the middle of a winter night. She had discovered her own strength, found her voice, and learned to trust in her ability to create the life she wanted. Transformation hadn't been easy or quick. There had been many nights when Sarah had cried herself to sleep, overwhelmed by painful memories or uncertainty about the future. There had been days when the work of learning new skills and adapting to a different way of life had seemed impossibly difficult. With each challenge she overcome, Sarah's confidence had grown. She learned to trust her own judgment, to speak up for her needs and boundaries, and to believe that she deserved happiness and respect. The scared girl who had hidden in her room while men discussed her fate had evolved into a young woman ready to take charge of her own destiny. The morning Sarah was scheduled to leave for her next adventure, the entire Shawnee community gathered to wish her well. Presented her with a beautiful necklace made of shells and beads, each element chosen to represent protection, wisdom, and strength. Gave her a horse of her own, a gentle mare named Winona that would be her companion on the journeys ahead. Sarah prepared to ride out of the valley that had become her sanctuary. She felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was grateful beyond words for the safety and healing she had found with the Shawnee, and sad to leave people who had become like family to her. At the same time, she was excited about the possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time in her life, Sarah was setting out on a journey entirely of her own choosing, with companions who respected her decisions and supported her dreams. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape. Beside her as they left the valley, and Sarah knew that whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together as equals and partners. The frightened girl who had stumbled through the snow 6 months earlier was gone forever, replaced by a young woman ready to build a life defined by courage, compassion, and hope. Ella had wound through forests just beginning to show their spring colors, leading toward horizons full of possibility and promise. Sarah urged her horse forward eagerly, ready to discover what adventures await someone brave enough to choose her own path through the world. The missionary settlement of Cedar Falls sat nestled in a green valley 40 miles north of Sarah's original home. When she arrived there in late spring, Sarah was amazed by what she found. The community consisted of families from many different backgrounds who had come together around shared values of education, mutual aid, and peaceful coexistence. Settlement's leader, Reverend Samuel, was a man quite different from the stern, judgmental preacher Sarah had encountered in her childhood. Reverend believed that true faith expressed itself through service to others, especially those who had been marginalized or forgotten by society. His wife, Elizabeth, ran a school that welcomed students regardless of their heritage or family background. Threw herself into her studies with passionate determination. Elizabeth quickly recognized her exceptional intelligence and hunger for knowledge. Within weeks, Sarah was reading at a level far beyond what anyone expected from someone with her limited formal education. She devoured books on history, mathematics, geography, and philosophy, often staying up late by lamplight to absorb as much as possible. His own place in the Cedar Falls community, sharing his knowledge of traditional hunting and farming techniques while learning new skills in carpentry and metalworking. The settlers appreciated his expertise in surviving off the land, and several families asked him to teach their children tracking and wilderness navigation. The relationship between Sarah and deepened during their time at Cedar Falls. They spent evenings walking along the creek that gave the settlement its name, talking about their dreams for the future and the challenges they had overcome together. Sarah found herself falling deeply in love with his gentle strength, his respect for all living things, and his unwavering faith in her ability to accomplish anything she set her mind to. For their happiness was shadowed by news from the outside world. Thomas Mitchell, and had not given up their search for Sarah. They had spread stories throughout the region claiming that she had been kidnapped by hostile Indians, and they were offering a substantial reward for information about her whereabouts. Troubling were reports that they had convinced local authorities to issue a warrant for his arrest on charges of abduction. In the legal system of that era, a woman was considered property of her father or husband, and his act of helping Sarah escape could be prosecuted as theft, regardless of the circumstances that had prompted her flight. Brenda and the other leaders of Cedar Falls were sympathetic to Sarah and situation, but they were also concerned about protecting their own community from legal trolls. After much discussion, they developed a plan that would provide Sarah and with the security they needed while also satisfying the legal requirements of the time. Solution involved Sarah legally marrying, which would transfer her from her father's legal authority to her husband's protection. While the concept of marriage as a transfer of property troubled Sarah's growing feminist sensibilities, she recognized it as the most practical way to ensure their safety and freedom under the existing laws. Careful to propose marriage only after making clear that he saw it as a legal protection rather than a claim of ownership over Sarah. He promised that their partnership would always be based on mutual respect and shared decision-making, regardless of what the law might say about a husband's authority over his wife. Accepted his proposal with joy, knowing that their marriage would be unlike any she had ever witnessed. They would be true partners, supporting each other's dreams and growth rather than one person dominating the other. Their wedding ceremony, conducted by Reverend, included vows they wrote themselves emphasizing equality, respect, and shared adventure. Newlyweds decided to establish their permanent home in a location that would allow them to bridge the gap between the white settlement and Shawnee communities. They chose a beautiful site near a natural spring, halfway between Cedar Falls and Swinter Camp. There they built a cabin that incorporated both European and Native American architectural techniques. Home became a gathering place for people from diverse backgrounds who were interested in learning from each other. Sarah established an informal school where she taught reading and writing to children from nearby Shawnee villages, while also learning more about traditional healing practices from visiting tribal elders. Built a thriving trade business that helped connect Native American craftspeople with markets in white settlements, ensuring fair prices for beautiful items like pottery, beadwork, and woven goods. His reputation for honesty and fair dealing made him a trusted intermediary between communities that often viewed each other with suspicion. Months passed, Sarah and his relationship with both communities grew stronger. They were called upon to help resolve conflicts, translate between groups with different languages and customs, and provide sanctuary for individuals facing various forms of persecution or hardship. Discovered a particular gift for helping young women who found themselves in situations similar to what she had once faced. She provided them with practical assistance like shelter and education, but more importantly, she offered them hope and proof that it was possible to escape from seemingly hopeless circumstances. Of the most significant cases involved a young Shawnee woman named, whose abusive husband had threatened to kill her if she tried to leave him. Sarah helped escape safely and provided her with the support she needed to rebuild her life. Eventually became one of Sarah's closest friends and an important teacher in their informal school. Sarah's work with vulnerable women gradually evolved into a more formal network of safe houses and support systems. She corresponded with women in other settlements who shared her concerns, exchanging information about resources and strategies for helping those in need. Work was dangerous as well as rewarding. Angry fathers, husbands, and other men who felt their authority was being challenged sometimes threatened Sarah. They received warnings from local officials to stop interfering in family matters and faced social pressure from those who believed women should remain under male authority regardless of circumstances. Supported Sarah's activism completely, even when it put their own safety at risk. He understood that her passion for helping others grew from her own experiences of powerlessness, and he admired her courage in using her freedom to extend hope to others who were still trapped. The most serious challenge came when Thomas Mitchell and finally tracked down their location. The two men arrived at Sarah's cabin one autumn evening, accompanied by a local sheriff who had been convinced to enforce the old arrest warrant against. Faced her father for the first time since her winter flight, and she was amazed to discover that she felt no fear. The man who had once seemed so powerful and threatening now appeared small and pathetic, clearly weakened by years of drinking and consumed by bitter anger at his inability to control her life. Thomas demanded that Sarah return to his authority. She refused calmly but firmly. She explained that she was now a married woman with legal rights of her own, and that she had built a life she was proud of. She told him that she forgave him for the pain he had caused her, but that she would never again place herself under his control. He enraged at Sarah's defiance and made the mistake of lunging toward her threateningly. Stepped between them immediately, and his calm but unmistakable readiness to defend his wife made back down quickly. The sheriff, who had expected to find a kidnapped girl grateful for rescue, instead found a confident young woman clearly living freely by her own choice. Importantly, several members of the Cedar Falls community had followed the sheriff to Sarah's cabin, having heard about the confrontation. Reverend and others to the sheriff about Sarah's good character and contributions to the community. They made it clear that any attempt to arrest or force Sarah to leave would be strongly opposed by many respectable citizens. Faced with a situation quite different from what they had expected, the sheriff advised Thomas and that there were no grounds for legal action. Sarah was a married woman living peacefully with her husband, and there was no evidence of any crime having been committed. The son left angry and defeated, but Sarah knew they needed to be cautious about future revenge attempts. They increased security around their home and strengthened their connections with allies in both the white and Native American communities who could provide warnings about potential threats. Confrontation with her father marked a turning point for Sarah. Having faced down the source of her childhood trauma and emerged victorious, she felt completely free from her past for the first time. She no longer carried any fear that she might somehow be forced back into the powerless position she had once occupied. This new sense of complete liberation, Sarah expanded her work dramatically. She began traveling to distant settlements to speak about women's rights and the importance of education for all children. Her story of transformation from powerless victim to confident leader inspired many others to examine their own situations and consider possibilities they had never imagined. Finn accompanied Sarah on the speaking tour, sharing his perspective on the importance of respecting women as equal partners rather than property to be controlled. His willingness to speak publicly about these issues was unusual for men of that era, and his voice added credibility to arguments that might otherwise have been dismissed as merely women's complaints. Travels also allowed them to visit regularly at the seasonal camps, where she continued to serve as a wisdom keeper for her people. The elderly woman took great pride in Sarah's accomplishments, often telling visitors about the frightened girl who had become a powerful advocate for justice and healing. Sarah approached her 20th birthday. She reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her from that desperate winter night to her current life of purpose and fulfillment. The scared girl who had fled her father's cabin could never have imagined the adventures, relationships, and accomplishments that lay ahead of her. She had learned that true strength came not from dominating others, but from understanding her own worth and refusing to accept treatment that diminished her humanity. She had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the commitment to act according to her values despite being afraid. Importantly, Sarah had learned that healing was possible even from the deepest wounds, and that survivors of trauma could transform their pain into power that helped others find their own path to freedom. Her work helping vulnerable women had shown her that broken chains could be forged into tools for liberation. Spring that Sarah turned 20 brought news that both Thomas Mitchell and had died during the harsh winter, victims of their own drinking and poor choices. Sarah felt sadness rather than satisfaction at this news, recognizing that both men had been trapped in cycles of violence and hatred that had ultimately destroyed them, and decided to mark this closing of a painful chapter by expanding their home to accommodate more guests and students. They built additional cabins on their property and established a formal school that welcomed children and adults from all backgrounds who wanted to learn reading, writing, mathematics, and practical skills. Also began writing down the stories of the women she had helped over the years, creating a record of their courage and resilience that could inspire future generations. She wanted people to understand that seemingly powerless individuals often possessed extraordinary strength, and that everyone deserved the chance to determine their own destiny. With Sarah's literary efforts by learning to read and write himself, despite having grown up in a culture that preserved knowledge through oral tradition rather than written records. He became Sarah's first editor and most trusted advisor, helping her find the right words to convey the hope and determination that had transformed so many lives. Warm summer evenings, Sarah and would sit on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the valley they had made their home. They would talk about the day's work, plan new projects to help their community, and share dreams for the future that seemed limitless in its possibilities. Often thought about the girl she had been during those terrible months before her escape, trapped in a cabin with no hope of rescue and no belief in her own power to change her circumstances. That girl would have been amazed to see the confident woman Sarah had become, surrounded by friends who valued her opinions and supported her ambitions. Transformation hadn't been easy or quick. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when the challenges seemed overwhelming. But Sarah had learned that growth required patience with herself, willingness to accept help from others, and faith that each step forward, however small, brought her closer to the life she was meant to live. Stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Sarah reached for his hand and felt the same sense of wonder and gratitude that had sustained her through every difficulty. She had found not just safety and freedom, but love, purpose, and the joy that came from using her gifts to make the world a little brighter for others. Girl who had once stared at the stars from her cabin roof, dreaming of impossible escapes, had discovered that the most impossible dreams could become reality with enough courage, determination, and faith in the power of human kindness to overcome even the darkest circumstances.